Hey everybody, Tim Parrish here for the Huntington Church of Christ. Welcome to Wednesday in the Word. One of my favorite books to return to in these Wednesday studies and in my preaching and in my personal reading is the book of Judges. The book of Judges is full of exciting stories and unlikely heroes and characters that emerge as leaders, people that you wouldn't pick to lead God's people or provide deliverance for them. And yet you find all these fascinating stories. But the reality is the book of Judges is really probably one of the darkest books. It's one of the darkest chapters in the history of God's people. Because the entire book is about the nation's rebellion against God and how over and over and over they choose to run away from God. They choose to either ignore God or kind of try to keep Him on but add some other gods to Him. And over the people go into some kind of bondage or captivity, and God has to provide deliverance. And He continues to do that. So you might argue, well, it's a book about deliverance, but I think underneath that you see that it's a book about the need, the constant need for deliverance. We understand this is a period of time when things are really, really bad, and we're told in that book that everybody's just kind of doing whatever he or she thinks is right. They're making up their own standards of what's okay and what's not. And that's a terrible time. And you see some of the terrible things that come. In fact, if you get to the end of the book of Judges, it is dark and it is hard to read. And it's a story that you wonder about even being in the Scriptures, and certainly not something that ever made its way into Vacation Bible School or any children's Bible classes. And so you have a lot of darkness, a lot of heaviness in that book. And then during that same period of time, there emerges this story of one family. And it's a love story. Now, the word love doesn't show up there in the book, but it's a love story, no question about it. And it's a story that, believe it or not, actually directly impacts you and me today. We are directly impacted by this story. I'm talking about the story of Ruth. Now, I hope you've read the book of Ruth. I hope you have some familiarity with what happens in that. We're going to kind of take the 30,000-foot view of the book of Ruth this evening. We're not going to delve into all of the finer points of all the things that we could talk about along the way, but I would encourage you, maybe even to hit the pause button right now. Grab your Bible or your tablet or your phone, open up your Bible app, and just read, beginning in Ruth chapter 1, verse 1, and just read the whole story without stopping. It won't take you but just a few minutes to do that. And then maybe come back to this lesson. If you don't have the opportunity to do it now, at some time in the next week, I want you to grab your Bible and sit down without any distractions and just read from beginning to end the story of Ruth. Now, it will seem maybe in some ways an odd story without some explanation, but especially once you've heard some of the things we're going to talk about tonight, maybe it'll make it a little bit easier to understand this particular story. It opens focused on one man and his wife, a man named Elimelech, and his wife Naomi. And Elimelech and Naomi are natives of Bethlehem. Interestingly enough, Bethlehem means house of bread, a place to go eat. But they've left the house of bread because there's not enough to go around. There's a famine. Sometime during the period of the Judges, there's a famine. And maybe that famine is a result of some of the judgment that comes in that book. We're not sure exactly where to place this. But there's a famine, so Elimelech takes his wife and their two sons, and he leaves and he goes to the country of Moab, across on the other side of the Dead Sea. Now, this is an interesting place to go because he's gone from the house of bread to a place that in Psalm 68, or Psalm 60 and Psalm 108, God refers to as his wash pot or his wash basin. And you had to dig a little bit to understand what God is talking about, the kind of imagery that He's using. But if you think back to those ancient travelers, the ones who walk around in sandals all the time, if you travel very far without some kind of shoe and sock like we would wear today, your feet just get nasty. Now, this is becoming more reality for a lot of us who wear Crocs or Chacos or some kind of sandals during the day, even though we're not typically walking all day down dusty roads. So you would get to the end of your journey, and your host would provide a pot, usually a big basin of some kind that was dedicated for only this purpose. and you put your feet over in it. It wouldn't have water in it. You put your feet in it, and then your host would have a servant or someone to pour water out of a pitcher onto your feet to rinse the dirt off your feet. And this was such a disgusting idea to them that usually this pot was dedicated. You didn't do anything else with it. It was only the wash pot. So when God describes Moab, the country occupied by the descendants of Lot, interestingly enough, as his wash pot, it's not exactly a favorable statement or a compliment. So they leave the house of bread because there's not enough bread, and they go into God's wash pot. Now, if you do much reading in sources, particularly if you read much from Jewish rabbinical sources, you'll find a number of Jewish rabbis that are really hard on Elimelech, and they will argue and make a strong case that the bad things that come into Elimelech and Naomi's life over the next few years are a direct result of this terrible choice. That it shows that they didn't trust God and that they were greedy and all these other things. May I just offer you this little slice of different thought? Could we not also say that if there's not enough food, that going to another place in search of food is not necessarily an indication of a lack of faith? Maybe it's the idea that maybe this is what you think God would have you to do in order to save your family. You go where there's food. Well, we could argue this in a circle all day long about whether Elimelech was right or wrong to leave during the time of famine. But what happens next, what he sets in motion with that choice, is very interesting. They get into the land of Moab, and both of their sons end up marrying women from Moab. Mahlon and Chilion are their sons, and they marry Ruth and Orpah. Except things are not great for them in Moab. Yes, I guess there was food. They were spared from the famine. But not long after they get there, Elimelech dies. And then Mahlon dies, and Chilion dies, and Ruth is now a part of the story with her mother-in-law Naomi and her sister-in-law Orpah, and they are 3 widows in a time that is very, very harsh to widows. It's not like there's any kind of government program. There's really not even that we can tell a societal program of any kind that cares for women who are widowed. And so without husbands, now Naomi without sons, this is not a good way to frame your life. And Naomi says, you know, I don't have any choice. I've lost everything here. I got to go home. The only chance I have to survive is to go back to Bethlehem, to go back home. And Ruth and Orpah both say, we'll go with you. She tries to discourage them, and after a little bit, Orpah does in fact turn around and go home. But Ruth makes this commitment to stay with her. In fact, there's a real good chance that a lot of you who may be watching this had Ruth's words somewhere in your wedding ceremony. The idea of going together and this beautiful image that wherever I go, wherever you go, I'm going to go, and your people are going to be my people, and your God is going to be my God. Our lives are intertwined already, and I'm not going to leave you. I'm going with you. We could argue it's faith on the part of Ruth. We could argue lots of things, but that's where the story goes, and she heads home. But these years have been hard. If you've ever experienced loss, some of you watching tonight will have experienced the loss of a child, the loss of a spouse, maybe both. And maybe you have some sense of exactly how it would feel to have been emptied out in the way that Naomi says she has. Her name Naomi means pleasant. But when she gets home, nobody recognizes her. She doesn't look the same. Loss has taken a lot out of her. And she describes herself as one who was full, but who has come back empty, as one who is pleasant, but who has come back bitter. And she says, you shouldn't even call me Naomi anymore. It's not an appropriate name for me. You should call me Mara, bitter. She was hurt. She was broken by what has happened, and she's not the same. Well, no one is, are they, who survives loss? No one who buries children or spouse is ever exactly the same again. And maybe you feel some kinship with Naomi in the beginning of this story. Maybe you too feel like there was a time when you were pleasant or full. But maybe in your life right now you feel bitter or empty. Maybe that even causes you to wonder where God has been in the middle of all this. And maybe that's one of the questions that's been here for Naomi. Probably because of the time in which she lived, she credited God with the loss. And it didn't make her hate God or angry with God necessarily. It was just the theology of the day that God gave and God took away. Like we see in the story of Job, that's probably the attitude that Naomi had. But she's at least back home. And here she is, and things maybe can change because when they've come back, there's no more famine. In fact, they've come back at harvest time. Barley, one of the most common crops, the staple of the diet of the Hebrew people, made the bread that they ate every day. And so it's barley harvest time. And so in some ways, if they're coming back and they're going to need some assistance, this is the best time to do it, right? Beginning in chapter 2, we read that when they get back, there is a relative of Elimelech's named Boaz. And Boaz seems to be a very wealthy farmer. And so there is an understanding, according to the law, that when it was harvest time, farmers were not allowed to harvest all the stalks of grain in their fields. They were, in essence, to kind of cut the corners and leave the borders and the edges of their field, so that those like Naomi and Ruth, who didn't have husbands or sons, who needed assistance, could go to those fields and could gather some grain that they could eat and store by to get by in the months that were ahead. It's one of the ways that God saw to the care of people who were in need. And one of the ways that he instructed his people all along to care for needy people. Well, as this story moves on, Ruth goes to Naomi and she says, "Is it okay with you if I go and get us some grain? I know there'll be some left and I can go." And she says, "Yes." And so as she's going, the Bible says that she just happens to come into Boaz's field, Boaz's territory. Now, you and I reading this today would say there is nothing happenstance about this. She gets there, she greets the reapers, and she starts in behind them. Well, it didn't take long for Boaz to notice, maybe because he was in the field with his reapers, that somebody new is there. And I don't know if we're to assume that Ruth is attractive or how much he can even tell that about her, but he knows this is somebody different, and he begins to make inquiries as to exactly who she is. And so if you go to the text, this is chapter 2. The servant in charge of the reapers, verse 6, replied, "This is the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the land of Moab. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves.' Thus she came and has remained from the morning till now. She's been sitting in the house for a little while." So Boaz speaks to Ruth in verse 8. He says, "Listen carefully, my daughter. Don't go glean in another field. Don't leave this one. Stay here with my maids. Let your eyes be on the field which they reap and go after them. Indeed, I've commanded the servants not to touch you. When you're thirsty, you go to the water jars and you drink from what the servants draw." And she fell on her face. She bowed to the ground and she said, "Why have I found favor in your sight, that you should take notice of me? I'm a foreigner." But Boaz said, "All that you've done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband, that's been fully reported to me, how you left your own father and mother and the land of your birth and came to a people you didn't previously know. May God reward your work, and may your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge." She said, "I have found favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me, and indeed have spoken kindly to your maidservant, though I am not like one of your maidservants." Now, there's some interesting things that happen in this conversation and some interesting details in what happens next. So you have this first meeting where Boaz comes and he says, "Listen, I don't want you to go anywhere else, okay? You stay here in my fields. You're going to find everything you need. You're going to be protected. You have some security. You don't have to worry about it. I'm in charge of these people, and they're going to take care of you. You get hungry, there's something to eat." In fact, he invites her to his table. You need a drink of water? Servants are drawing water. You drink just like anybody else would. Everything you need is going to be taken care of. And she said, "But I don't understand this. I don't understand. I've heard how you people kind of think about foreigners, and I'm one of them. And he says, yes, but what you did in staying with Naomi, I heard about that, and that means a lot to me. You know, he's Elimelech's family, and so there's a kinship, but even if there wasn't, he understands that Ruth is not an ordinary kind of woman, so he invites her to sit there with her and invites her to share a picnic lunch. And then he secretly tells his reapers, listen, I don't know if she knows anything about reaping wheat or not. Drop some along the way. Don't clean. I know normally you would make nice clean cuts, leave a little, and then when you get some in your bundle, accidentally drop some on the ground. Pretend to be clumsy, because I want her to have all that she can. And so she doesn't know that. She's going behind him and she's picking up what she gets. And when she gets home to Naomi, she's got like maybe what would be the equivalent of 40 or 50 pounds of barley. And Naomi, of course, is excited and she wants to know where this came from. And when she tells her where it came from, she said, yeah, I know him. Naomi said, he's good people. You need to stay close to him. You need to do whatever he says and don't go to anybody else's field. And so she kept harvesting with the maids of Boaz. She kept going back, and daily she's bringing home what she's able to gather and what they're dropping on the ground for her. So it's a really neat story to this point, right? It's really tender. It's really sweet. Naomi and Mara and Orpah, or Naomi and Ruth and Orpah all experience loss and pain and heartache. And they come back, and who knows what they think they're going to find, but what they find is grace. What they find is care and appreciation and protection and food security, financial security that comes along with food security. Something that a lot of widows would not have possessed in those days, certainly not a foreign widow. And that's not lost on Ruth. Now we pick up in chapter 3, verse 1. Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, my daughter, shall I not seek security for you that it will be well? Now Boaz is our kinsman. Behold, he winnows barley at the threshing floor tonight. Wash yourself, anoint yourself, put on your best clothes, and go down to the threshing floor. Don't make yourself known to the man till he's finished eating and drinking. And when he lies down, you see where it is, and you go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he'll tell you what to do. And she said, I'll do whatever you tell me. So she went. And she did it. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down. She came secretly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, he was startled, and he bent forward. And there was a woman lying at his feet. And he said, who are you? She said, I'm Ruth, your maid. So spread your covering over your maid, for you're a close relative. Then he said, may you be blessed of the Lord, my daughter. You've shown your last kindness to be better than the first, by not going after young men, whether poor or rich. Now, don't fear. I'll do for you whatever you ask. For all my people in the city know that you are a woman of excellence. Now it's true that I'm a close relative, however there is one closer than me. Remain this night. When morning comes, if he'll redeem you, good, let him redeem you. But if he doesn't wish to redeem you, then I will, as the Lord lives, lie down until the morning. Now, there's a lot going on in this little story here that's a little strange to us, these weird customs. And depending on what source you read, you'll get maybe a couple of different ideas about what exactly happened with this uncovering of the feet, and whether there was anything inappropriate that happened or anything sexual that happened. And it just kind of depends on how you take this. It seems that there's a lot of question and concern here about reputation and about being thought of the right way. And so it tends to make me think that's not how the story went. But there's one thing that's really easy to read past. And so I want you to see it, because I think it's a huge theological connection. Okay? So if you go back to the time that Boaz has first met Ruth, he says to her in verse 12 of chapter 2, may the Lord reward your work and the wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge. This was a common image. You see it some in the Psalms and other places, the idea of the wings of the Lord and baby chickens under the wings. Jesus uses this imagery when he looks over the city of Jerusalem to describe what he wanted to do with his people. Well, if you come then to what happens here during the night, she asks for this same thing from Boaz. Will you please cover me? with your wings, with your covering. Yes, I know the Lord is doing it. Now I'm asking you to do the same thing. It's almost a reverse marriage proposal. And Naomi set this thing in motion. And I don't want to paint her as just some kind of ancient matchmaker. She's really trying to look out for the future well-being of her daughter-in-law. She says, look, I can't provide for you. And so I want to make sure that you're taken care of. So there's this interesting conversation that takes place that points all the way back to Deuteronomy chapter 25 and what maybe you'll find called as a levirate marriage. And if you go back to Deuteronomy 25, and I want you to hear some words there, because some of this will help to put this in focus just a little bit. Beginning in verse 5. When brothers live together and one of them dies with no son, the wife of the deceased shall not be married outside the family. Her husband's brother shall go in and take her to himself as wife, perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And it shall be that the firstborn whom she bears shall assume the name of his dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. But if the man doesn't desire to take his brother's wife, then his brother's wife shall go up to the gate to the elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to establish a name for his brother in Israel. He's not willing to perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. And the elders of the city will summon him and speak to him. And if he persists and says, I don't desire to take her, then his brother's wife shall come to him in the sight of the elders and pull his sandal off his foot and spit in his face. And she shall declare, thus it is done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. And in Israel his name shall be called the house of him whose sandal is removed. Now that's an interesting way to continue family lines, right? But this is called the law of levirate marriage. Brothers are living, one of them dies without a son. His brother is obligated to father a child with his brother's wife in order that that child will then be named for his father and the family line will continue. Well, that's an odd custom that I think a lot of us are probably glad is not enforced today, because some of us might not want those arrangements to be our family arrangements, right? Well, it was the case here, and that's what we're dealing with. Even though Mahlon and Chilion are both dead, the same idea still applies to the family and who they are and what they've got. And Boaz said, look, you didn't chase after some young buck. You came back here and I know who you are. I know the kind of woman you are. I want to do this for you. I want to marry you. But there is a relative that's closer than I am. So we got to go through him first. And if he'll do what he's supposed to do, then that's great. And if he won't, it's even better, because I'll marry you. So the next day they get up and they go to the city gate, chapter 4. And Boaz is there, and he took the elders aside, and they said, hey, this guy's the closest relative of Elimelech. You guys know Naomi's back. I just wonder if you want to, she's got some land that she wants to sell, and it passes to you first as a member of the family. What do you think about that? Well, at first, the relative is like, yeah, I'm in. You know, I'll buy the land. And he's probably just thinking he'll own the land for himself, until Boaz springs on him. Oh, yeah, it comes with a daughter-in-law. And you got to have a child with her. And all this will be his, not really yours. And the guy says, I'm out. I'm not going to do this. And Boaz says, then I'll do it. And what's interesting is verse 7 says, when they make this agreement between them, that the nearest relative who does not want to redeem Ruth and this land pulls his sandal off. He signified, look at verse 7 of chapter 4. This was the custom in former times in Israel concerning the redemption and the exchange of land to confirm any matter. A man removed his sandal and gave it to another. And this was the manner of attestation in Israel. So the closest relative said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, and he removed his sandal. Now, I don't know that anybody spit in anybody's face, but it seems that this goes all the way back to Deuteronomy 25. That also indicates to us that the story of Ruth was written down many years later, when this wasn't a custom anymore, but it was then. And so looking back, they said that was how they used to do it. That was the handshake over this deal back in the day, was taking off the sandal. And we know, because we just read it in Deuteronomy 25, that this is what happened when the nearest relative would not fulfill this duty. And there seems to be no hard feelings. No one seems to be judging him because of this. Well, when that happens, then Boaz marries her and raises up a son, and there is joy and celebration. Verse 14, after the son is born to Ruth and Boaz, chapter 4, verse 14, the women said to Naomi, "Blessed is the Lord who has not left you without a redeemer, and may his name become famous in Israel. May he be a restorer of life to you and a sustainer in your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons has given birth to him." And they continue this great celebration. And then there's a little bit of genealogy on the end, and that's the end of the story of Ruth. Except you may have listened to that entire story. You may know the story, and you may say, what does that have to do with me? You know, I may be a widow, or I may have lost my child, but I'm not arranging new marriages with relatives, and I'm not trying to hook my kids up at the family reunion. There's some stuff that's going on here that seems a little strange, and the impact on us is actually seen in that last little section, the genealogy. Because if you look there in verse 18, now these are, well, verse 17 tells us that they named the baby Obed, and that Obed is the father of Jesse. And Jesse, you may remember, is the father of David. So we go back to Perez, and to Perez was born Hezron, to Ram, to Aminadab, to Nahshon, to Salmon, to Boaz, to Obed, to Jesse, to David. We have established this family line. But you may not remember who Perez is. You see, he's a descendant of Judah, and that's very important, right? To maintain the lineage of David, for instance, as a king, coming from the line of Judah. But we also know that the lineage of David is continued all the way to Jesus himself. And Jesus, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, well, the line has to be established. But watch this. You may go back in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 38, and you may remember that Judah and Tamar have this son Perez. And Judah is Tamar's father-in-law, who goes into her thinking she's a prostitute. And she gets pregnant. He forgets about her. And he's going to, once he finds out that his unmarried former daughter-in-law is pregnant, he's going to kill her. Till she surprises him by saying, "Oh, by the way, it's your baby." That's not a great story for the origin of your family tree, is it? And yet that's who Perez is. So yes, we're connected to Judah, and that brings us a very important line, but don't miss that it goes through something that is not very pleasant, maybe a little more on the bitter side, to get us to where we are. Well, when you look at this lineage, you go back and you realize that Judah is in fact then the 6th great-grandfather of Obed. And Obed, of course, leads us very quickly to David. But if you continue that genealogy, if you go back to your New Testaments, you look at the genealogies that Matthew and Luke give to us, you're going to find that Tamar and Judah's relationship is not the only questionable one that comes into this line. In fact, if you follow pretty soon after David, you're going to find that the next in line is Solomon. And you may remember that Solomon's mother is none other than Bathsheba. Now, if you fast forward a little bit and you look around through some of this, you rewind a little bit, you begin to dig, you also find that in this same lineage, if you think about Boaz and who he is, you may not remember this, but Boaz's mom is a woman named Rahab. Yes, that Rahab. And so here you have this really interesting family tree that is full of people that you wouldn't necessarily think about being in it, and not the least of which is here, Ruth. Ruth is a native of God's washpot. She doesn't belong in the people of God, and yet here she is marrying into the people of God and becoming the grandmother, minus a few generations, of Jesus himself. You see, sometimes the darkest moments in our past, whether that's in our genealogy or in our own personal life, the darkest moments of our past do not have to be what defines us, but they never stop being a part of our story and who we are. The experiences of life, even the negative experiences, the emptying experiences of life that leave us bitter, are still important parts of shaping and molding us, especially when it comes to our relationship with God, and whether those things push us away from God or draw us near to God, or some of both. You see, I look at the story of Ruth, and I think the story of Ruth is a whole lot bigger than a woman and her daughter-in-law. It's a lot bigger than that, and there's lots of layers to this story that point us to Jesus and the church and redemption, and Jesus as the Redeemer, and all these kinds of things. But I just really want to bring it down for you tonight and have you think with me about your own story. And what's in your story and who's in your story. That if you could use the eraser of time, you'd go back and change or fix or undo. Well, maybe the point of the story of Ruth, one of the points, is that we don't live our lives trying to undo the things that have happened or trying to cover the actions, the mistakes, the terrible stories of our ancestors. We acknowledge them and we build on them. And we understand that even the darkest moments of our own past can be the very moments that God has orchestrated to make us who He wants us to be, and Himself to organize our story in such a way that people generations from now could read it and say, wow, you see how that fits together? You see, you and I are impacted by this story because we're impacted by Jesus the Christ. And as we are connected to Jesus as our older brother, then there's a sense, spiritually, metaphorically at least, in which we just read about our great, 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 great grandmother, Ruth. Pretty neat story, huh? Well, I hope you think so anyway, and I hope you learned some things tonight. Thanks for stopping by.